Alex Del Carmen, Associate Dean, Professor at School of Criminology at Tarleton State University, joins me now. Dr. Carmen, this is a tragedy that no one can deny, but where we are now is the second tragedy playing out on America.
Good morning, and thanks for having me. There is absolutely no question, right? So what happened in Minneapolis last week is, in my view, something that, in the circles of law enforcement and the public at large, we will never forget. But at the same time, what's going on across the nation now, this rebellion that has now a tone of a revolution of some sort, is just simply unacceptable. And I think what's happened is a lot of folks have lost their message in the violence. I mean, it's hard to be sympathetic to the quality of justice when you have people out there robbing and taking away from those of us that work really hard to make a living on a daily basis. So it's just simply unacceptable.
I see articles out there, even by my colleague Judith Miller, an epic American failure, the U.S. response to the killing of George Floyd and protests in its aftermath. And that is such a misleading appraisal of the situation in a headline. This is not a U.S. response. We have an insertion. We now have facts, evidence, things that you teach your students in criminology is what's required, that there are groups deliberately inserting themselves into this. Antifa, Black Lives Matter, other anarchist groups, whatever, individuals who even aspire to that belief system or those goals for political purposes. And yet we continue to sit here and have this mixed assessment that this is a U.S. problem.
Yeah, and I think that part of what you just said is spot on, right? So we've got these political groups that are simply and have been waiting for a long time in order to be able to insert themselves in a social movement of this sort. If you really think about it and pause for a second and imagine all the enemies that the United States has within its borders and outside of its borders, and you think about the fact that many of them are simply sitting back enjoying the view on their television sets every evening or every afternoon, and on top of that, plotting what else they could do to hurt us, right? And wondering whether or not our democracy has the fortitude to withstand itself as the days and weeks progress. I mean, it is truly, truly a calamity that we have fallen prey to ideologies that go way beyond the George Floyd incident.
I'm glad I have you here. You've got both the experience in law. You're someone who's been an instructor for a police department at an academy level, which is very important here because apparently there were failures also in the training, and we've seen this before with certain members of law enforcement. That's an important aspect. But from a legal perspective, when you look at what's happened in Minneapolis following the killing of George Floyd, the arrest and charges against Derek Chauvin, and to the best of my knowledge, no action taken on the other officers. Are you comfortable with where it is, or should there be more done?
I think that if you step back and you make two great points, right? The first one is as it relates to training. I think you're right. I think this is a training issue. But I also would go beyond that, right? And I would say to you, I've been a criminologist for 22 years, and I have trained over 15,000 police officers and every chief of police in the state of Texas since 2001 on racial profiling. And I can tell you right now that part of the issue that we see here is that there are people that don't belong in law enforcement, period. And a lot of agencies across the United States have looked the other way in terms of the minimum requirements that allows them to come into the ranks of law enforcement into a very noble profession. You have most of law enforcement are honest, decent, hardworking people, but there are some people that don't belong in law enforcement. So as it relates to that, I would say it goes beyond training. It's actually a recruitment issue. And to your last point, I do think that there are going to be obviously more charges, but I imagine that they're gathering evidence. They are making sure that they don't blow the case, because quite honestly, they cannot afford to. So I think we have to be a little patient to see what these prosecutors are going to do in days and weeks ahead.
And I fully agree with you. I've said it before. I've said it on radio and television. The process is playing out as it should, to the point of training. And then to go beyond that, to your point about recruiting, we've seen over the years, and unfortunately, due to the politics of this and the social engineering of law enforcement by many, especially on the left, the reduction of the requirements. This is something we've seen in fire departments, police departments, where they have not kept the standards high. Do we need to reverse that in this country? And how do we do that?
There's no question that we need to go back, right? So if you look at the past 5 to 10 years, particularly after the Ferguson incident, there was and we saw this in the classroom, right? As criminologists that teach future police officers in our classrooms, just a loss of interest that people have had to join the ranks of law enforcement. And so I think a lot of police departments became quite desperate having all these folks retire. They weren't filling their academies. And so what they did is they lowered the standards. They allow people with prior criminal histories of some sort. They allow people with prior drug addictions into the ranks of law enforcement. And as a result of that, you can't train the untrainable. You cannot place a different heart in a 6-month experience at a police academy. And I've taught at academies. I know what's taught at academies. And I will tell you that we can convert a civilian into a police officer, but we cannot transform somebody's heart. And there are folks that just simply don't belong in the profession and are making the rest of the profession look horrible.
There's going to be, obviously, Dr. Carmen, a lot of legal issues coming out of this. Business owners, citizens, the arrests of protesters, the arrests of rioters. From a legal perspective, looking at the various elements of what's happening now in cities across America, how do you effectively prosecute whether it's a protester who went too far or an outright anarchist or somebody who's a member of Antifa, which could rise to a federal level charge?
It's going to be up to, obviously, the prosecutors, right? And at the federal level, I'm less concerned than I am at the local level because of the fact that it's been so politicized, right? So if you look, for instance, at what's going on right now in Dallas County, right? So the DA in Dallas is actually saying that he is not going to take any of these cases relevant to protesters. And so there's going to be more of that across the nation where these folks that are elected by the people are going to simply be sympathetic to a cause, in some ways putting aside the violence that is attached to these acts and going to look the other way. And that's going to be really unfortunate for law enforcement that are out there risking their lives, trying to maintain order, and getting these folks in. I mean, imagine if the rest of the country knows that they will never be prosecuted for protesting, what that's going to do to the rest of the United States as it relates to violence. I mean, it's going to be a mess.
Yeah, I mean, we often talk about broken trust between police and communities, and that happens. But the broken trust is in the oath they took, whether elected or appointed in some way, to uphold the law, regardless of the person in front of them. So is there something that can be done, should be done? Obviously, they can be not elected next time around, but we know that's a bit of a farce because of the incumbency and the political aspects of this. But what can people do if they're harmed by protesters / rioters? I'll put them together in some way. You become a looter, a criminal the minute you break a window and go in. And then the law enforcement arm that's responsible or entity that's responsible doesn't act.
I would say to you that it may very well be that we're going to see that people are going to start filing lawsuits, store owners and folks that have lost property on those that actually are looting, right? Because if the criminal law and those that actually, enforce the criminal components of our law simply refuse to take action, then civil law is going to be the only course of action for many of these folks, right? It's going to be to get them where it hurts them most, which is their pocket. And at the end of the day, what breaks my heart is you see these folks that are middle-class Americans that have put all their savings into a small business, and they're out there struggling with Corona and all the challenges that we've had in the past few months. And all of a sudden, in a matter of minutes, they've lost every single item that they have they had on sale and their entire life savings because people just decided to take what doesn't belong to them. I mean, that's just simply immoral, unethical, and illegal, and we've got to do something about that. I mean, I think that the message and the sympathy is getting lost very quickly because our tolerance level goes to the effect that when we become victims, it's hard to be sympathetic to those that are aggressors.
Yeah, and when the American people turn on this, as I believe we've reached, I see this tipping point, I hear it, and, it also, I don't think it'll do a disservice to the justice process against those four officers because that will proceed, it's on its way. But when they turn against this, they may well turn an unsympathetic ear to protesting, period. In some part, that's already happened.
And I have another point for you that I think it has not been talked about, which is what exactly do they want? Have we really paused and asked ourselves, what exactly is it that they're asking for? Because when you look at protesters in the past, it's either been against one person, one elected official, a certain movement, like the civil rights, for instance, wanted equality for all. Okay, that's wonderful. The women's movement, they wanted to vote. There's no question, that's wonderful. But at the end of the day, what exactly is the purpose here? Is the purpose to have justice for George Floyd? I mean, we heard his brother yesterday say, please, please, please do not engage in violence. My brother would have never advocated for this. And we see his family talk about a God-fearing family that do not want to advocate for violence. And so at the end of the day, what exactly is their purpose? What do they want? Do they want the Commission on Equal Justice? I'm all for that. But let's talk about it. Let's sit down and have a civilized conversation instead of going out there and victimizing our fellow Americans.
Very well said, Dr. Carmen, and I appreciate you joining me today. We've got a lot to deal with in this country right now, and we need saner voices out there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me.